Welcome to Module 2, Choosing Your Path and Your Team. This course was created by the coaches at Growing Intentional Families Together to help you grow a happier, healthier, adoptive family. Hello, I'm adoption coach Susan David, and I'll be guiding you through Module 2, Choosing Your Path and Your Team. As an adoption coach and as the mom of 3 now adult adopted children, I've seen lots of changes in adoption. What has not changed is the need to begin the adoption process using one or more adoption professionals. How do you select reliable, competent, and ethical professionals to assist you? Well, let's get started so you can find out. Adopting a child will likely be one of the most pivotal decisions of your life. It will change who you are and with whom you will be connected for the rest of your life. In this process, you'll want to be well informed and well prepared. And you'll want to ensure that the people that you're working with are not only legitimate, but of course competent, and that the information on which they rely is accurate, up to date, and comprehensive. Identifying where you will find not only the information, but the people you'll be working with can be daunting. So let's take a closer look at how to decide who will be your adoption professional. Who are the adoption professionals? Your state's social service agency is one. Also, private nonprofit adoption agencies. Some agencies are licensed nationally, while others are regional, state, and even county specific. Adoption attorneys are generally required to finalize the adoption paperwork. However, you may also choose to use an attorney rather than an agency if you have either located an expected mother yourself or working with the attorney who then works through a licensed and hopefully ethical facilitator. Facilitators must be permitted in your state in order to use their services that match a prospective adoptive parent with an expected mother. Another important professional that will be common to all adoptions, no matter the path to adopting, will be the state licensed social worker, whose role is to do the home visits, conduct interviews, and create a report that is known as the home study. And this report ensures you are able to parent. What do these adoption professionals do? Well, I've kind of hinted at it, but each adoption professional's role is really to assist you either to find an expected mother, ensure the state's requirements are met, and that you are in compliance with the law, and hopefully they'll attend or be mindful of the needs, the special needs of an expected mother. They'll also hopefully provide some education for you as you go into this role of being an adoptive parent. Where do you find them? Well, nowadays, most adoption professionals, whether public agency, private agencies, attorneys, they are found through the internet. Sometimes people find their adoption professional through word of mouth. You know, a friend of a friend who used a particular agency and had a good experience. So that's another way that you can keep your eyes and ears open for an appropriate adoption professional for you. When you need them begins at the start and throughout the adoption process. Very few people are doing adoptions without some sort of assistance. There are particular points of involvement, such as the initial application period, when you might be required to attend adoption related classes. Then there's the home study process, a pretty intense process with its series of interviews and fact finding by the social worker. And when you and an expectant mother have decided that you are a match, of course, it's the expectant mother that's deciding that really. There will be a consent agreement, and later there'll be the proper termination of parental rights and the final adoption decree, making you the parent of a child with all of the rights and responsibilities that come along with being a parent. So, how do you find the right one for you? That's a little tricky, but your research and your growing knowledge about the process will assist you in finding a competent and reputable adoption professional to shepherd you properly through the process. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a bit later, some of the considerations. Talking about reputable adoption professionals necessarily requires us to consider what is ethical and what is legal, not only for adoption professionals, but for you as a prospective adoptive parent. You'll want your behavior and your choices to be above board. Your child will someday want to know his or her story, and you'll want it to be one that you can relate with honesty. It probably seems like such a long time into the future at this early stage of your adopting journey. Perhaps it's more helpful to remember that any fraudulent activity on your part, the agency or attorney, can be grounds for voiding the adoption. That seems reason enough to follow the law and ethical practices. There's a tension that sometimes exists between a prospective adoptive parent's yearning for a child and an expectant mother's choice to parent or instead to relinquish their child for adoption. One important point that helps reduce that tension is the prospective adoptive parent's choices and behavior. They should seek to be child centric. You can ask yourself, are my own desires to be a parent overriding what is in the best interest of the child? As my colleague points out later in this course, adoption does not necessarily mean a better life, but a different life, and you are not saving a child. Of course, there are situations where a child has come to adoption because their home environment is not safe. In that case, the state intervenes and removes the child from the home. We can agree that that action is in the best interest of a child. I've included a list of ethical practices in this module's reference page entitled Ethics in Adoption. But at the very least, we want all adoptions or all adoption decisions to be made on the best interest of a child or youth's best interest over his or her entire life. Adoption should never result in undue profit, and children and youth shouldn't be treated or seen as a commodity. And finally, although remember that list is even more extensive than the 3 points I'm making here, all parties to the adoption must respect the legal and moral rights of both birth mothers and birth fathers to consent or not to the adoption. Of course, legal considerations are paramount. An agency or attorney must follow the law. Each state has its own adoption laws, and many are similar to one another. For example, all states require relinquishing and terminating parental rights before a court can issue an adoption decree. And I've already mentioned that all adoptions require a home study to make sure the adoptive parent is capable of parenting. You'll learn more about home studies in Module 3. It's not unusual for a prospective adoptive parent to worry about an expectant mother changing her mind. Yes, she has every right to do so, even if you were covering her allowable expenses. How long a birth mother has to revoke her consent varies from state to state. A reputable agency or attorney will be very familiar with your state's laws and even the more complicated statutes that contemplate what is now a pretty common occurrence, an interstate adoption where the prospective adoptive parent lives in one state and the expectant mother lives in another. Sometimes there are extra legalities imposed on the adoption. For example, If adopting a Native American child or going out of the country in an international adoption, you'll want an agency or an attorney that's familiar with these more complicated situations. Have at minimum a basic understanding of your state's adoption law and those important moments during the process, such as relinquishment, termination of rights, allowable reasonable expenses for birth mothers, and what constitutes undue influence. Let me say that again. And what constitutes undue influence, consent, and revocation. You don't have to know all the whys and wherefores of a statute to know if something is illegal. Common sense can help you. Let's look at an easy example. If someone is promising you a child in your arms in exchange for money, that's illegal. Sometimes shortcuts can seem appealing. Let's say the birth father is unknown and there's no attempt made to contact him to sever his rights to the child. That's a no go. Lying to the birth mother. Don't do it. Purposely giving the birth mother money that's not allowed under the statute. Not okay. By the way, you can and probably will be expected to cover the expectant mother's expenses that are allowable and reasonable and will be accounted for and approved by the court. These situations I've recounted are not only illegal and unethical, but they're morally repugnant and they will negate the adoption. Compliance is the name of the game for adoption professionals as well as prospective adoptive parents. Some ideas for finding the right adoption professional include using a licensed professional. You can check with the Better Business Bureau. Ask for references beyond those provided on an attorney or agency website and look into whether there have been any complaints lodged with the state. Also, memberships in vetted professional organizations are helpful. For example, for attorneys, such an organization is the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproductive Attorneys. That's a highly vetted college of particular attorneys who have a great deal of experience in adoption law. When first starting out in the adoption process, how you find the right adoption professional is not just about ethics and legalities. It's also about what do I have to do to successfully complete the adoption process. In my experience, that usually involves thinking about financial considerations. One of the first things people think about in determining which path they will take to adopting is how much adopting a child will cost. Costs will vary depending upon if you use the state's social service agency, a private adoption agency, or an adoption attorney. It can also vary some between a domestic adoption and an international adoption. Assessing the costs of adopting is, of course, important because if you have some idea of how much it may cost to adopt, say, an infant in a domestic infant adoption, or maybe a child through international adoption, or perhaps a brother and sister using the state's social service agency, you'll know what you can afford and you'll be better equipped to execute your adoption plan. Probably the easiest costs to explain, or at least justify, are the universal costs applicable to all adoptions. One such cost is for the home study. As you've heard, all prospective parents, no matter what type of adoption they intend to pursue, will have to complete a home study. Its purpose is to evaluate the fitness of the parents, prepare the prospective parents for adoption, and also gather information about them so that an appropriate match between the child and parents can be made. The cost for the home study is generally paid by the prospective parents. In some cases, the fee for the home study is included in the overall agency fee. A reputable agency should delineate the cost of home study and other fees, who is responsible for paying it, generally the prospective adoptive parent, and when it is due. In the case of adopting through the state, there may be no charge for conducting the home study, although prospective parents may incur fees for medical or psychological evaluations that may be required as part of the process. Even if you travel out of the country in an international adoption, you will be completing a home study, and that will be part of your dossier or application to adopt in a particular country. Now, let's look at another universal cost. Legal fees are incurred because all domestic adoptions and many intercountry adoptions must be finalized in a court in the United States. The cost to adopt will also include the expectant mother's reasonable and allowable expenses, your profile creation, and the costs associated with matching yourself with an expectant mother. Sadly, the cost to adopt is far greater than the cost of a home study and legal fees. Let's look at the different paths to adopting and their costs. Most of the costs of adopting are dependent upon the type of adoption you are planning to pursue. Expenses vary. Domestic infant adoptions cost significantly more and will necessarily be through a private adoption agency or adoption attorney. Adopting through a state's foster to adopt program will be less expensive. Such programs include children, sometimes called waiting children, whose parents' rights have already been terminated or close to being terminated. And such foster to adopt programs may contemplate adopting siblings or a child with challenges. International adoptions can be just as expensive as agency domestic infant adoptions because there are often travel and stay requirements of a particular country in addition to the agency fees. Those costs can add up rather quickly. Domestic infant adoptions will generally be through a licensed private agency or adoption attorney. Costs nowadays range from $20,000 and can be well over $60,000. Such fees will generally include the home study costs, adoptive parent education, preparation, and training, birth parent counseling and medical care, social work services involved in matching a child to a prospective family, and matching services including profile creation and the marketing to find expectant mothers. Rarely does word of mouth locate an expectant mother. National outreach is the norm. Attorneys, too, can handle such infant adoptions. Their fees can be similar to agency fees, and they may choose to work with a facilitator whose fees may be an additional cost and whose role is to locate an expectant mother. Note that these facilitators must be allowable by the state and hopefully they're required to be licensed. If you choose a private adoption agency, you will have to pay more in terms of adoption fees and other expenses compared with any public agency in your state. And your financial expenses can increase if you are paying for the court approved expenses of the birth mother's hospital and medical bills. Your actual expenses will depend on your specific situation. There are two main ways to adopt a child from public foster care in the United States. The first is you can pursue adoption from foster care through your Department of Social Services. That's the state agency I've been mentioning. This process includes the cost of home study and the training that is required to foster a child. While you are fostering a child, you'll receive a monthly subsidy. The amount depends on the age and the needs of the child, and of course, the state in which you live. In this case, you are in a situation where the child or the children's parents' rights have not been terminated. Since reunification of the child with the parent is the primary goal of any social service agency, until it's proven that reunification can't be achieved, which is a lengthy and frustrating process, it's a more haphazard plan for adopting. The second way is the foster to adopt program. So let's look at adopting a child whose birth parents' rights have already been terminated or close to being terminated. The second and more feasible way to pursue adoption from foster care is through the state's foster to adopt program. Sometimes the state will even partner, have an arrangement kind of thing, with a private adoption agency to help a prospective adoptive parent complete their foster to adoption home study, training, and match with a child, or often a sibling group, or maybe a child with special needs. These are children that are ready to be adopted from foster care since their parents' rights have been terminated or are close to being terminated. In this case, you would pay the fees of the attorney for the finalization. There might be other expenses too. For example, you might want to have some testing done when adopting an older child. Through the state or through the state assisted by a private agency, this method will be significantly less than a private domestic infant adoption and even an international adoption. While it will be more expensive using the state with the private agency, since there are fees paid to the agency for services rendered, you may prefer working with an agency to adopt from foster care as the process may run more smoothly and you may receive more individualized attention. Let's talk about unanticipated costs. These can range from nominal to significant. For example, medical expenses over and above regular medical expenses of either the birth mother and or the child. You may want to have a medical assessment to evaluate a particular condition to help you gauge if you're capable of taking on a specific situation. Another unanticipated cost might be the cost of traveling to meet and then having subsequent visits with an expectant mother. Usually, you'll have some idea of what your legal expenses will be. However, unexpected legal costs can occur. For example, if a man doesn't learn he is the birth father until after the adoption, he might then decide to contest it and seek custody of his child. That would be an unanticipated cost. Obviously, this would be traumatic for all involved and expensive as well. By the way, this situation can be avoided by securing the proper surrender documents that ensure the parental rights of both the birth mother and the birth father before a child is placed in your family. I've talked a lot about a lot of expenses. Believe it or not, here are some you may not have thought about. Working with more than one adoption agency, creating your online presence, preparing your home so that it's safe, getting your finances in order, updating or executing your will, hiring an adoption coach to walk you through the process, childcare costs. If you have a child already, you'll face childcare costs when you're attending meetings, classes, visits with your attorney, and so forth. These additional costs can take a bite out of your pocketbook. Let's look at some financial assistance options. As you are learning, the costs of adopting can be significant. Let's talk about some ways to pay down these expenses. Possible options that are available to you before you adopt could be bank loans. Loans may be available to you using your house equity or as a line of credit that you can use temporarily until you claim the federal adoption credit on your income tax returns. Another way that people finance the adoption process is through family financial support. Other people have created GoFundMe pages asking family and friends, once again, for financial help in the adoption process. Grants may be available to you, and adoption assistance programs through an employer are popping up. So that may be another way for you to finance the adoption journey. Another way you can control costs is to choose an adoption agency that uses sliding scale fees. After the adoption, there is a federal adoption tax credit available to you. Of course, you have to be eligible for it. Let's look at that. The adoption tax credit lets families who were in the adoption process, say this past year during 2022, claim up to $14,890 in eligible adoption expenses for each eligible child. Taxpayers can apply the credit to international, domestic, private, and public foster care adoptions. Now, there are limitations for sure. For instance, you can't claim the credit if your adjusted gross income is over $211,000. And you have to owe federal taxes in order to get the credit. This credit can be used once for each child if that child meets the other eligibility requirements. Whatever costs you are incurring, you'll want to keep good records and keep all your receipts, including maybe some expenses you might haven't thought about yet, like incurring traveling, meals, transportation costs, hotel stays. The amount of this credit can change from year to year, but so far this credit has been around for quite some time. Your state may also have general adoption credits or incentives. In particular, as we mentioned earlier, adopting from foster care may come with money for family therapy, medical benefits for your children, and a monthly subsidy that is based on the level of need that your child may have. Whether your path to adopting is adopting through the state, an agency, or using an adoption attorney, keep track of the information from your research. You'll want to refer back to it as you contemplate which path is best for you. I have previously mentioned adoptions do occur via direct placement using a facilitator and an adoption attorney handling the legal work. The adoption facilitator's role is to match expected mothers with adoptive parents. Not every state allows facilitators, and even where they are allowed, many states wisely require them to be licensed. There is also a growing new trend in direct placement adoptions using media platforms that list prospective adoptive parents' profiles for a monthly or annual fee with the goal of matching an expectant mother with a prospective adoptive parent. Some of these firms actually offer further assistance in identifying agencies that you might want to work with, social workers that you'll need for the home study, and profile creators to make the profile that you use in creating your online presence. This type of service is a kind of do it yourself adoption kit, and its goal to make adoption more affordable and the waiting time shorter is a good one. However, there are risks in working directly with an expectant mother, and there is always the possibility of coercive pressure in pre-birth matching. By the way, the use of a so-called baby broker is increasing in popularity. Be aware that many of these individuals may not be licensed and therefore you'll lack basic legal protections. In some states, the use of baby brokers or facilitators is actually illegal. We have included an important resource on this issue in the reference page at the end of this module. Keep in mind when you search on the internet, the top returns are not necessarily the most reputable. They are most likely the ones with the largest advertising budget. Using reputable agencies reduce some of these risks both for the expectant parent and the prospective adoptive parent. I mentioned back in, I don't know what slide it is, but some ways to check would be checking references, Better Business Bureau, see if any complaint is lodged with the state against the agency. Those are ways to make sure that you're working with a reputable agency. Whichever path you choose to adopt, and whoever makes up your adoption professional team, make financial decisions with your brain and not your heart. Be prudent when planning your adoption budget to avoid adding undue financial pressures. Leave some reserves to meet the inevitable unexpected expenses. Whatever way you might decide to fund an adoption, you'll benefit from staying within your budget as best you can. Good financial choices will help you build a steady foundation on which to build your family. Now, we have focused on the monetary costs of adopting because it often determines which path to adopting a person chooses. There are also significant personal costs as well, especially from the perspective of the adoptee. Let's hear once again from Coach Sharon as she shares her perspective both as a coach and an adoptee. Sharon says, "You first looked at the ethical and legal considerations of adopting. And of course, you want your adoption professionals to be competent and above board. And you've looked at financial considerations." Sharon says, "I'd like to share some of my insights on the non monetary costs of adoption from the adoptee's perspective. Not from the dollars and cents perspective that gets paid by adoptive parents, but rather what it costs adoptees as they lose some of their human rights in the adoption process. When you recognize these costs at the start of the adoption process, you can do something or some things to ameliorate them for your child. Some of the costs of adoption are for adoptees, and these costs are intangible and life altering, and they are often overlooked or dismissed. With only 10 U.S. states allowing adopted adults to request and obtain their own original birth certificates, many adult adoptees remain in the dark about their birth heritage and their ancestors. In all other states and the District of Columbia, adopted persons must obtain a court order or use ineffective and outdated registry systems. Often, access to birth certificates and records adoptees are looking for are subject to veto or redaction, either by adoptive or birth parents. This certainly restricts the adoptee's right to obtain their own vital information. Such policies block the ability to track one's medical history or identify any predisposed health conditions. These restrictive policies can also negatively affect an adoptee's mental health. Coach Sharon goes on to encourage prospective adoptive parents to learn and preserve as much information as they can about their child. It's also important to share this information with the adoptee at age appropriate times. The cost of not knowing is too great. We've come a long way from the time of the orphan trains when children were paraded on stage and were claimed by any willing adult without any preparations or assurance that the child would be safe. Thankfully, much has changed about society's view of adoption. We can still do better. Today, organizations such as the American Adoption Congress, among others, promote a Bill of Rights for adoptees. Coach Sharon highlights some of the rights that resonate with her. For example, the right to know her full origins, ethnic and religious background, her original name, and any pertinent medical and social details. Again, adoptive parents can help reduce the negative cost of not knowing and being denied access to their child's rightful information, even as they plan for and complete an adoption. I hope that Coach Sharon's important observations and her own experience remind you to proceed in a way that is child centric. This will benefit not only your child, but your entire family as well. As we're nearing this module's close, I'd like to ask you one powerful question, and that is, how do I balance the three competing interests of the child? My own personal self interest in creating my family, and the interest of the expectant parents. In each of our modules, we are asking the same three important conversation questions. They are: one, after completing this module, what are you thinking about the most? Two, what aspect of this module surprised you and why? And three, how will you put what you learned into this module into action? Let's hear closing thoughts from each of our coaches. Coach Sally says, on the surface, adopting a child may seem straightforward, but the legalities require our careful attention because there is a child in the center of it all. Coach Sharon says, consider the information your child might need in the future. You can ameliorate the cost of them not knowing by obtaining pertinent birth family history. Coach Gale says, be sure to consider both the short term and the long term impact when determining the type of adoption you choose and the professionals who will help you. And I add, the adoption process varies from state to state, but all adoptions require termination of parental rights before any adoption can take place. It is only then that you can proceed to an adoption. What's next? You'll be joined in Module 3 by Coach Gail Swift as she discusses the home study and other important preparations. We invite you to investigate some of the resources and references used in this module. This course was created by growing intentional families together. The information provided is not intended as medical, therapeutic, or legal advice. This presentation may not be shared or broadcasted without written permission. Address inquiries to us at giftcoach@giftfamilyservices.com.